Hello. Hello. Ladies and gentlemen, would you mind taking your seats? We're about to start this evening's BAFTA presentation. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for staying this evening and staying beyond the bar, which is even more impressive. My name is Phil Ashcroft. I'm on the board here, BAFTA Los Angeles. I chair the Digital Media Committee, and we are very fortunate to be joined this evening by Arash Amal. Thank you, Arash. If you could come up, that'd be great. We have just an hour to get through an extensive career that spans a variety of media and a variety of countries. So let's get started. Thanks, Arash. Thanks for coming.
Oh, you're welcome.
Gosh, where to begin? Let's begin with now.
Okay.
So currently wrapped on War Games?
No. Okay, by the way, can everyone hear me? Yes? Yes? Great. Okay. No, we have spent the summer, I've been locked in a room with the director. We're just at sort of the beginning of pre-production. So it's pretty exciting phase, and it's been pretty intensive, but I think it's been pretty productive. So we're going to see. You'll hear more about it soon.
Very exciting. And just to get the plug in, when's it out?
When the studio says they've dated it. So we're just waiting for that.
No spoilers tonight. Yes. So one thing I found really fascinating is you've had experience in film, TV, and prior to that, a vast experience in digital media. One of the things that this conference is all about is the intersection of digital storytelling and the traditional entertainment business. And when we were talking on the phone, one thing that struck me was how the creative process was working in film versus your experience in TV or perhaps digital. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That's a very broad question. I'm going to just sort of, we've got a lot of time. So broadly, sort of beginning with film, there's an essence to it that film, the development process hasn't really changed. I mean, I think if you walk into, any studio, whether on the lot, walk into any producer's office, walk into any executive's office, what you'll find fundamentally is, you're still developing a movie. And it really goes back to, the story and the script. And then obviously, this is a product, a creative product that's going to be put out in theaters. And, you have theater owners who do not like the concept of, multi-platform releasing. They don't like the idea of, day and date, which increasingly you're seeing in the independent sector. But if you kind of close your eyes and think of classic Hollywood, it's still like it was in the 80s. I mean, it's still, you're thinking about the movie in every shape or form.
So when do you meet your first digital person in the movie making process?
Well, it depends what you mean by digital person. I mean, if you're talking Avatar, then you're probably meeting a digital person right from the beginning. But if the question is, are you somebody who's involved in the digital sphere? I mean, I think on the movie side, as a writer, as a creator, possibly never. It's really very much, the actual sort of act of making, writing, producing, making the movie, editorial, and then release. Ultimately, what you're really looking at is, unless it's a multi-platform world like Avatar, it's, increasingly, where merchandising used to be, the marketing components, it's sort of how do we expand and grow the universe of the movie. And, obviously more and more, if you look at Marvel, more and more, that's it's becoming, an integral part of, the entire universe. So you're kind of, studios like that. And if you look at, how, Disney, for example, has built out, a lot of its other, non-Marvel franchises, it is about creating continuity, almost like a TV, environment.
So were you not under any pressure to do that in war games, to build out the, it strikes me that it could be that type of world, for instance.
Well, it really is. I mean, I can't, speak too much for the, studio's plans on war games. But, it really is an atypical experience, when you're developing any kind of brand, known property, that, it's entirely dependent on, the nature of the studio. If you are a Disney or Warner Brothers, which very much is part of a big integrated entity that's, driven towards, okay, how big in an expansive world can we create this? Can we make this? Then you do get components of that coming in. But again, to pull it back to the story of, the story and the writers and the creators, even then you're kind of fitting into an ecosystem. So if you're writing Guardians of the Galaxy, it's as far as where the interactive component goes. I mean, as the writer, and even potentially as the director, unless you're James Cameron and it's your vision, it's there's they're over there and you're kind of over here. So, again, I don't want to generalize, because there's always, there are, in digital terms, there are always the forward thinkers, but, it's kind of, what's the norm? What do you see on a day in, day out,
right,
of all the thousands of projects being developed and all the, tens of hundreds of movies being made.
And have you, I guess by way of contrast, had that experience as a creative, kind of fleshing out the world first and then the movie being a part of that? Or
well, it's something that actually lives much more in television. And I think movies are only slowly getting to that sort of continuing story, continuing sort of sagas, sort of environments, whereas television naturally lends itself to that, and that's where you kind of need universes. So in terms of my own experience, a couple of years ago, I had an idea for a father-daughter spy series, and I initially wanted to write it as a movie, and I started developing it as a movie, and it sort of started to become too big. I thought, okay, so this is a TV series. So, I've got all this universe, and there's like a 30-year history, and, so it's horizontal and vertical, so in terms of time and space. And I happened to meet a guy called Stephen Christie, who's the president of a company called Boom Entertainment. Now, Boom Entertainment is, well, back then, it was a company called Archaea, which was acquired by Boom, but Boom Studios is one of the major comic book publishers in the country. And he said, look, why don't you work with us, work with our design team, work with the, with our writers, and build this world out into a comic book. And suddenly in a comic book environment, you can go phenomenally, bigger than you can even go in a, in a TV show. And so, Marvel speaks to that, I think, in terms of, they're bringing that universe into, lots of different, screens. So I said, okay, I've never written a comic book. I don't know where to begin on a comic book, but they paired me with sort of some very talented folks. And
so what would the creative team look like in that pairing? So you have specific comic book writers and yourself?
Yeah.
And
so we had, so we went through a process of, I had a very strong vision, and I'd written this like 40-page document, which was, all the characters and the world, and sort of, and then I'd written a separate sort of 20-page document, which was, the core arc of, the first few issues. And not knowing where to begin, they initially, we had 6 or 7 artists that came in, and they, sort of auditioned, if you like, and suddenly you start to get an idea of, my God, this world, it exists, I can touch it. So these are the different versions of what these characters can look like. And then while we were going through that, we went through a series of auditions for writers. And there was one writer, this lovely lady called Marguerite Bennett, a Southern girl with a very wicked sense of humor and a very strong handle on story, who one of the things you'll find is that female comic book writers are actually very rare. It's it's interesting sort of how far behind the curve as an industry they are. And she had written a few Batman storylines and was slowly making a name for herself, and she literally came in with a pitch that just blew everything away. It was a very innovative way of telling the story. And so it went great, right? Okay, so this is what I want, so I'm going to sit with you. And she's actually across the country, so we were on the phone almost every day for about a month. And she went away and she wrote these scripts, and I edited them. She went away, she polished them, and meanwhile we had an artist who came in, and then we got actually television production designers who came in from American Horror Story, and sort of they came in and created kind of the look and feel, and then the artist slotted in, and suddenly you're actually in the middle of a pretty big sort of creative enterprise just off that idea, and you haven't even come anywhere near the vision of this eventually coming to life on television.
Right. So how do you, as the creator of this world, kind of sift this respective story? What goes into the comic, what you're going to put into the TV show, what you're saving for multimedia? It's
a huge juggling act. I mean, it was. When we sat down, and myself and Stephen at Boom, again, it always starts with like two people and a piece of paper in a room, trying to go, okay, we have this huge ambition of what we're trying to do. Where do we start? So, and where we started was actually very clearly we want to have two creative teams. So, you've got the comic book creative teams who will be extremely sort of, versed in the comic book world and how to tell a comic story, and they'll be going in one direction. Then you'll have a television writing team, and you effectively as a creator kind of sit in the middle. So, what you have is that it'll take on its own life, and it'll go in one direction, on the comic side. And look, a good example is The Walking Dead.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The Walking Dead, was a comic series for a very long time, and it's hugely successful now because of the success of the TV show. But if you actually follow them, they're on two different timelines.
And at no point Boom said to you, this is conditional on you getting a TV deal.
No, not at all.
So they're committed to.
They're completely sort of committed. We actually published the first issue after sort of 18 months. The first issue came out September 24th. The second issue comes out on Wednesday. And we were blown away. I mean, it was the best reviewed comic that Boom has had. It was actually one of the best reviews of the year of any of the comics. So it was pretty rewarding to see that. But then at the same time as that's been happening, we've been working on ramping up the TV show.
And where does the digital world fit into this, the overall story?
In what sense?
Well, I mean, I guess in certain examples, you may have a comic may come from a digital story or a web series, or there may be the comic first, then a web series, then the TV show, or there may be, there's various iterations. And
yeah, okay. So, well, the way to look at it is, you've got traditional forms of distribution. So comic book, it's still, I mean, we still haven't come out in digital form in the comic. It's still like, they're very scared and nervous about piracy. As you probably have a lot of that in digital. But so, and they do have that window, which tries to support, the comic book stores and so on, and similar to theatrical. So, there's that, and obviously the television component. But I think once the TV show takes off, then you'll start to see the digital components kind of fitting in the middle, because you've got on one side you've got motion comics, and then on the other side you have, shorts and storylines that may be tangential to the core.
So a sort of a bridging piece for Boom might be, like they did with the Watchmen, for instance, those sort of motion.
Yeah, and I think if the way you look at it is like on one end of the spectrum, you have books that are just the digital version, the sort of thing you get on Comixology, the apps. On the other side, you have what they did for Lost, even like years and years ago. I mean, the stuff that we're talking about has been going on for almost a decade, or over a decade in some cases, and stuff, for example, that the BBC was even doing back in the day. So not much has really moved on, but it's still, that sort of the short web kind of component, more device-led, sort of creative pieces, like stuff that you watch on your phone or on your iPad. And then on this side, and then everything in between. So motion comics kind of sits somewhere in the middle. Yeah.
So it's a good segue. In a previous life, you haven't always been a fully paid writer. Prior to this incarnation, you were indeed wholly in the digital world, a digital strategist, right?
I began life. Thank you. Yes, I began life.
Sorry. Easy.
I began life. I think my first ever job was working in a team in a small company called Screen Digest in London. There was 12 of us at the time, making a case for Warner Home Video, actually on behalf of Warner Home Video, for the entire Hollywood studios, for everybody else, that selling DVDs was a good idea. Because back then, it was for a very loud and charismatic fellow called Warren Lieberfarb, who I think co-invented DVD, but it was, you got to remember, it's sort of technology only is successful in hindsight. So back then, we, and turned out that it was successful. And then it was actually maybe 2002, 2003, it became very quickly that this thing was going to run its course. So I sort of went to my boss, who at that time was just next door, and said, look, I think there might be something in digital. I think that this is an area that we might be sort of being able to, potentially exploit and, provide consulting for. And I think the studios are going to get into it. Broadcasters are going to get into it. And this was 3 years before the iPod video had been launched. So, and the first thing we did, and then I'll sort of segue into something more interesting, was myself, and in fact, one of my colleagues, former colleagues, who's speaking here, I think, at the event in the next couple of days. We, again, two people in a room with a piece of paper, we sat down and collected we called every single telco and cable operator in the world, and asked them for their broadband numbers. And there was literally like 500, sort of, or we got 1,000 people connected. And this was in like 2002. And we built this chart, and then we just projected how many people are going to be connected. And, you got this like hockey stick thing. And we're like, you know what? Let's start sort of looking at it. So, we started modeling it and looking at what happens if you go and what happens if you sell ads. And, a lot of the, the strategies you see today, I mean, we were working on it, 10, 12 years ago. We were working with the BBC, we were working with Channel 4, and then it went international. So within about 3 years, I found myself in a room in Cupertino with the iTunes Movies team, with Jobs standing over and just going, okay, so what's iTunes Movies going to look like? And, what's Netflix, and, Netflix, which to us for 10 years was just this little DVD business. And what's that business? I mean, I remember being in the room when this, we got this idea, is we're going to sort of stream some stuff. And we got this little box, it's called a Roku, we just invested in it, and literally it was a chalkboard, and they just went like, here's the, we think these are the broadband numbers which you put together, and these are, what we think devices are going to be. And, I think there's a delta here. So DVDs are going out, this is like 2007. So, we're going to just bet the company on it. So it was a pretty exciting time. But yeah, that sort of, I went from that to, okay, what does it look like on the creative side?
So were those parallel tracks for you? You were, you were writing and strategizing at the same time, or I mean,
it was like day and night. Like back then, it was
you were working 24/7 when you had two jobs.
Well,
you're like Batman.
Kind of, you do that, yeah. Except without the crime fighting. It was like you sort of day you do that, and then at night you kind of you pursue your dreams and your passion. And I've always wanted to write. And there was a lovely man called Nick Harris, who I just made it sound like he's died. He's actually alive. And he was an agent in London who moved out here and said, look, I think you have a future, and come out here, and your voice doesn't fit in England, but I think you've got something that we could sell here. So I wrote a script and came out here, did what I called, or the Evian tour, which was take 40 meetings in 10 days at all the various studios. And they're like, and the reason it's called the Evian tour is when you go in, they give you a bottle of water. So by the time you're getting in your car to go back home and you hand the rental over, it's sort of like overflowing with empty water bottles. And I was like, oh my God, I think they might want me. Went back and sort of told my wife, who now is my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, let's go. And so I moved out here just as we were getting ready to sell Screen Digest, and we'd grown the company to like, I think 100 odd people, and sort of it was ready to, let it go, and came out here. And that first script got made into my first little movie called The Expatriate with Aaron Eckhart, which, you give them your script and you wave a goodbye and you say, okay, I just hope the movie's like, it comes back in one piece. And that was it.
Wow. And so you never fell back on the digital career at that point. That was.
I mean, I don't want to make the digital career sound like it was, I could have been a barrister, like working at Starbucks. So it wasn't, it was actually a very thrilling time to be in digital, because you literally were this whole new idea of bandwidth, and then suddenly mobile and 3G and everything that kind of came into that was very exciting. But it's sort of, I think we're in a second cycle now. And I think, in 2010, it sort of started to, that initial phase of, I suppose, trailblazing ended. And it just felt like, it seemed like the right time. And, Hollywood was knocking my door, and once they come for you, they come for you. And you can't say no.
And is there anything that you take from that experience that you draw on today? Is in your current
from the digital side to, well, I think it's understanding the business. It's knowing that actually, whether executives, whether they're distribution executives, whether they're creative executives, whether they're television or whether they're features, they're under the same levels of pressure. And the pressure is fundamentally, you're looking at a business that there's more consumption than ever before. There are more movies. I mean, it was true back in 2009, 2010, even more true today. More people are consuming more movies than ever before, but they're paying less. More people are consuming more television than ever before, but they're paying less. And it's a fundamental kind of what we call the commodification of entertainment. And so that brings pressure onto the executives, because you're looking at an industry that in some shape or form, definitely in features, is downsizing, but also is becoming vertically integrated. So you're kind of managing up and managing expectations and looking at what other divisions are doing. And when you pick up something, when you buy a new piece of IP or material and you start hiring writers on it, the question is, okay, what happens beyond the film? What happens beyond, the television show? What is the lifespan of this? And again, you kind of go back to the universe concept, but the organizations aren't designed for that. So you don't have like, oh, I can just call the digital guy and just
right.
If I'm making a buying decision.
It makes, when you were talking about that, it makes me think, when you talk about a universe, about the world of nonlinear and games to some degree, when you're kind of mapping out these worlds. Have you ever thought about creation for games, for Butterfly, for instance?
I mean, the one thing I think as a creator you learn is that in this multi-platform environment, I'm never going to be a better games writer than a dedicated writer of games. I'm never going to be able to write the comic book better than Marguerite, because that's what she does, and she's, you know, acclaimed for it. I can write TV shows and I can write features. So it's a question of knowing your world and your universe.
Right.
So yes, so to your question, I do believe the Butterfly, the comic, is, you know, we have sort of the whole TV component is now, you know, it's up and running, and, you know, you're going to start seeing announcements imminently. But, you know, there will be games. But again, you know, I don't know where I'd find the time, and B, it's kind of, you know, you have to sort of sit in the middle of all of those creative teams and just make sure, at least tonally in the universe, it's all kind of going right, but getting the best talent for it in the specific arenas.
Great. So we've got to a point where we can probably throw it open for a few questions if people are, or I can carry on having conversations. Any questions? Yes.
With Netflix partnering with Weinstein to do a day-and-date release VOD and theatrical for Crouching Tiger and Dragon 2, do you think others will follow suit, such as 50 Shades would be great day-and-date VOD and theatrical?
That's actually a really good question, because what that gets to is sort of this underlying idea of, you know, are the new platforms, are they origination platforms in terms of, you know, new types of entertainment, or are they just new distribution outlets for, you know, traditional forms of entertainment, like, you know, a movie, the sequel to a movie that came out theatrically, but now, you know, coming, you know, being distributed digitally. Was the question, is it a good?
Yeah, I mean, do you think others will follow suit? Do you think this is a good thing to start?
I think it's a great thing to start, and I think others will absolutely follow suit. And this is something that, you know, kind of, you know, traversing the, you know, the experience on the distribution side and the experience on the creative. This is what they've been trying to do for an awfully long time in sort of on the digital platforms. Like, it's been a question of getting the capital to be able to do it, getting the eyeballs to be able to do it. You know, now that Netflix has whatever 30, 35 million people, and you'll see increasingly more of these kind of deals happening, because it's sort of they were skirting, the various platforms were skirting with it in 2007 or 2008, and the idea of sort of, you know, doing feature-length originals was only ever really held back by sort of, you know, windowing and, you know, but now you have a movie. I mean, we actually had The Expatriate was Radius TWC's one of their most successful multi-platform release on VOD.
Right.
And it was, I think, in that year, I mean, we charted in the top 10 when it was first released. It was number 3 in the UK. And it made, you know, the movie was like on a $10 million budget, and just in the US alone, it made 5 million plus on VOD.
Wow. In 2010?
In 2012, which is when it was released. So, you know, it suddenly is a very viable platform, you know, in the same way that, you know, one of the things that we were actually working for I was working for on the other side for Apple was, you should start investing in creating original content. Like, you should start creating, you know, iTunes. A lot of the indie movies that you have currently on the iTunes sort of, you know, indie tab, just finance them yourself. You've got 150 billion sitting in the bank. I mean, it's not going to cost you, you know, a small percentage of that. And then you have original content. Because now you're starting to see consumption is actually really up and high. And there's a reason why Harvey's actually releasing stuff day and date, and now, you know, getting into it where it's just purely digital. And, you know, I sat in an edit room with him on Grace for, you know, best part of a week, and all he ever wanted to talk about was like this great digital thing that he's got, you know, and how great it's going to be for the future of the company.
Do you not think there might be a bit of a danger that Netflix in some ways made it look easy to make great original content digitally?
Well, I mean, you've got to look at, you know, I think taste accounts for a lot. You know, they have good taste. They have good, it's not, you know, everyone knows it's not easy to make any, you know, you know, feature film or a television show. It's even more difficult to make a good one.
Right.
Right. So it's, you know, so who you partner with is huge. And you look at who Netflix has partnered with: House of Cards, David Fincher, Media Rights Capital, you know, on this example with Harvey, and the sort of, you know, leveraging a lot of the TWC IP. So they're making some smart bets. But
and also, I mean, where do you think the, or for you, where does, you know, one of the great things about these platforms, they have tons of data. How does that, or how do you see that helping or hindering or affecting the process?
Well, I mean, I'll throw that back because, you know, traditionally we had, you'd never, didn't really know what the data really was. If you look at theatrical or home video and whatever, and you had Rent Track and everybody. But in digital, everyone knows exactly, but the problem is it's Netflix that knows. Maybe the distributors know for their own titles, but the issue was that even back, you know, I mean, even sort of from the very beginning, there's always this big question mark: are they getting the exact numbers from the platform? They've got no way to check. And what the distributors know about sort of the financial performance, they don't share. So it's kind of like you have more data, but like no one knows what it is.
Right. I guess I meant sort of more on the commissioning side. It's kind of, you know, House of Cards being an example where the original series was already
it's
up
the
on
same. It's a black box. I mean, it's kind of, they know. But like if Amazon Studios is going to commission or recommission, you know, one of their originals, performance doesn't really play into it in the traditional sense. I mean, they said it themselves.
Right.
You know, and the question of, you know, is it branding, or is it just trying to get you to take out that Prime subscription? And the show, it's just enough that they have the brand of the show rather than how many people watch it. It's kind of like, oh, I like having it. I don't necessarily have to watch it. It's, you know, but I like having that service that has House of Cards on it because it's, you know, part of the.
I guess in some ways not so different to the cover mount DVD on the newspapers.
Oh,
10,
it's
15
exactly,
years ago, right?
it's exactly the same. It's the same reason why Walmart used to sell, you know, or sells DVDs. I mean, they lose money on each one, but they worked out that anyone who had a DVD in their basket actually spent 20% more on other products. And they worked it out perfect. And they were like, okay, so we'll just take that loss leader. And it's the same for somebody like Amazon. It's exactly the same. So the ratings really matter? Not really, you know. And for Netflix, you know, perhaps a little bit more. But again, if House of Cards starts to underperform, but it still adds to the prestige, you know, I think it's, you know, it's questionable whether, I mean, no one knows what the numbers are anyway.
Right. But and then on the creator's side, it's not so different because Amazon or Netflix or Hulu or whomever is really just another buyer.
Yeah, I mean, you go where the money is.
Right.
And, you know, when we first started the conversations on Butterfly, you know, my agents at CAA who actually pioneered some of these deals in terms of, you know, the Netflix deals and the Amazon deals, you know, will come in the same breath, say, okay, we got Showtime really excited and we got Amazon really excited. And it's Showtime's money against Amazon's money, against HBO's money, against Netflix's money. It doesn't really, you know, it's not segmented in that way on your side. It's kind of who's going to pay for the show, what's the reach, who's going to see it, how much creative freedom am I going to get, you know, can I tell the best story that I possibly can within this environment?
And I guess one thing that intrigues me is in the global economy that we're in right now, and certainly in entertainment, how you know, these services kind of are the great thing about Hulu and Netflix is they're domestic services, right? It gives you opportunities to do things in other markets. How you think about those international
Well,
markets.
I mean, they're
rapidly growing, right?
Yeah, they're global services. I mean, now it's, this ability to, and this is what's really exciting about the new platforms, which you don't have in television. And obviously the deals are getting more creative, let's say, because traditionally, how the territories were split up. Now you have the emergence of a truly global distribution network. And that's exciting because, time, sort of time difference aside, to be premiering something at 8 p.m. here, it's 4 a.m. somewhere else. You have to take that into consideration. The ability to have a world, tap into a potential audience of 1 billion people. Again, that's extremely, extremely exciting. And it starts to become more attractive in terms of, when you're creating something and you want as many people to experience it as possible.
1 billion people binging on your TV show.
Yes, it's like Nirvana.
It sounds like if everybody in China jumps at the same time, maybe the internet will fall over.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. It's but that's another good point as well, the whole binge aspect to it. It's starting to feel a lot like you're writing a novel.
Interesting. And how does that, I mean, are you...
Because, by the way, I absolutely, I'm not a huge fan of because I'm impatient, of the weekly model.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that increasingly you're going to see TV shows, and I'm seeing sort of TV shows going down that road where it's really about, I want it now, I want all of it, and I want to engage with it in the same way that I would engage with a good book.
Mm-hmm.
On my own terms, I'll read as many chapters until I fall asleep, and then I'll pick it up, or I'll watch the whole thing and not sleep at all. And that sort of is really, what you see there is the beginning of the intersection between features and television.
Right, I was going to say, how did that affect you? Take Butterfly as an example.
That's what actually brought me to television, because as a feature writer, you're kind of looking at sort of a very linear story, which kind of beginning, middle, and end, but it's in a very compact period of time, and it's sort of very high tension and so on. So structurally, there's no gap between one. Okay, right, we're going to leave you on this cliffhanger. You're going to forget all about everything we told you, so that we're going to have to give you a recap at the top of the next thing, and then we're going to have to take you forward again. But the ability to actually say, you know what, and this is what's happening with Butterfly, is we're going to do a 10-hour movie, and we're going to do something that is actually as rich and as complex as a novel. And the first of these models that actually has seen light is True Detective. Right. Where you had one writer who wrote all 8 episodes, and the whole thing. You had feature actors, feature director, like it was a feature experience. Admittedly, it came out 1 a week, but ultimately it was designed. If you watch the whole thing from beginning to end, is actually a sort of a multi-layered novelistic approach to a television series that effectively uses feature film tricks. Mm-hmm. I mean, if anyone remembers sort of episode 6 or whatever that was, where Matthew McConaughey is going through sort of the various drug dens, and it was I think a continuous. Everyone was talking about it the next day. It was amongst all the executives that I was talking to, we had a continuous 10-minute shot that was very cinematic, and it was. But that's the changing nature of television, and increasingly getting the need for these shorter series. So you've got a network still on their 24-episode model. But then, I've had so many people go, you know what? The idea of having 6 episodes like you have in England is such a great idea. It's such you can just tell those like 6 hours really, a very tight, compact, contained experience. And, Netflix, for example, is the perfect platform for that. Right.
It's such a thriving genre right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you kind of look at it now, True Detective was 8 episodes, Plan for Butterflies is 10 episodes. But it's still exactly the same experience. That you'll get the most out of it if you binge it.
Right. And so would in your world, you'd have them all ideally produced, ready to go, and you'd drop them all in one fashion, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And with your conversations, I mean, that would be one thing if you were talking to Netflix. If it's Showtime or someone else, would they be, presumably they want to string it out like a regular schedule?
Well, you look at, there's two elements of that conversation. There's the release pattern, but then there's also the production. And a lot of the high-end cable, like HBO, like Showtime and Starz, typically, what you have is all the scripts are written. The cast is locked in and so on. And then in many cases, the production, you actually, you shoot and you edit and everything is kind of pretty much done. I think it's the idea of chasing a schedule is very much a network model, and at least not the entire thing done. You're kind of down a road. So if you're airing episode 2, you're only locking episode 12 or 13 by that point. So it's, you're way ahead.
Interesting. Yes, sir.
How do you feel about the HBO new streaming service?
In 2008, I was working very closely with the HBO team on this very model. And it's taken them 4 years to finally get to a place where they have enough leverage over the pay TV operators to be able to do it. So to answer your question, I think it's great. I think the market's been ready for it for at least 3 years. And it's something, I mean, if you saw Netflix's share price, as soon as they announced it, I think it was 25% wiped off Netflix. So it's, the market has been so sort of waiting for this thing to happen, but they've had to untangle so much politics with the pay TV guys because ultimately it's, I would argue it's the beginning of people cutting the cord and just saying, okay, I want 4 channels and I don't really want the other 500.
But they still have to charge $17 a month.
Yeah, I mean, those shows, they're not cheap. They have a very, expensive slate, and whether or not $17 will, I mean, again, Netflix is a very different value proposition, but they raised it by $1, I think. It went from $7.99 to $8.99, and the rate of new subscribers kind of dropped by 50%. It was just this quarter. They had 2 days of really bad news. One was HBO, and then the next day was we're not growing as much because we raised it by $1, and we're not. So the question is, $17.99. Who do you get? Do you get the high-end homes, or do you suddenly start to look at this shortfall that the pay TV guys used to pay you because they put such a premium on it? I don't know. Do you think it's a good idea?
Potentially, of course it is. It has to be. But I mean, they can't price themselves at what they're charging individual consumers for cable service.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, yeah. Yeah, and they've been, they've been scratching their heads about it, for an awfully long time, and even sort of the early internal tests showed that there is sort of this strain at anything beyond $10, and so anything at that $9.99, $10 mark, you start to sort of then exponentially lose the number of potential customers. But if you're over 15, I didn't know that they were at $17.99. Oh, okay. So I would probably say, I mean, the target that they've had is $15. And I think that's sort of a psychological price point. If it goes over $15, I can't see it being.
Yeah. And do you, I mean, presumably this is a watershed. Others, Showtime, AMC, all the other guys will follow soon. Yeah,
I mean, I have DirecTV and I can't get half of the ones that I'm supposed to be able to get. Like, I think even for the free channels, like FX and so on. I go onto it and say, oh, sorry, your cable operator, your pay TV provider hasn't paid us any money, so you can't have it. I don't think that's sustainable because we've known piracy has been a huge problem. And from a creative side, you're very aware of piracy. I mean, you see it in your bank balance. Mm-hmm. So, you know, something, again, had to give at some point. And I think HBO has realized that. I remember, this is a sort of a little anecdote, in maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we could actually time when a show went out to the minute when it was going to appear on a first piracy ad sites. And it was literally like just over an hour from its final sort of final broadcast in the final market in the US. So I think it's Hawaii or something. And this was literally like an hour after Hawaii, they would hit. And that was 5, 6 years ago. So HBO has to do something. And
well, they've been actively courting the piracy. I mean, a lot of their press recently has been how encouraged they are by the number of stolen
I think
episodes.
that's an awesome amount of spin.
Right?
I think it was sort of, you know, I have to, you know, tip my hat to whoever came up with that and said, you know, it's great. Yes, we have no crossover between the guys who use it online to stream and the guys who steal it online to stream.
They're our super fans.
There are super fans. Our super fans don't like to pay for our shows.
Super free fans.
Yeah, and you know, they feel entitled to it. But it's a huge problem. And what you had was, you know, the music business that got completely totaled by piracy and then never recovered, and is only now, you know, starting to figure it, you know, and a couple of years ago starting to figure it out. Then you had the movie business that was over aware of what was going to happen, and to the point that they literally chopped themselves at the knees not to do any deals with, you know, the digital platforms, and only now are starting to do the sort of things that Harvey's doing. Yeah. But then you had television that kind of they launched Hulu as a free proposition. They were like ad supported. And then they suddenly go, you know what, we're actually going to be making a little bit more money for the next few years through pay TV and tying things up. So they just spent all of that money, reined it all back again. And now they're starting to push it back out, you know, push the boat out again, because now it is quite serious.
And do you, in this sort of constantly shifting world, where do you see, I mean, is a Google, is a micro, I mean, you know, all of these guys have had forays into creating services, funding original content, you know, with some success, but mostly not.
Mostly no success.
Do you look at the space and think, I should go and talk to Google or YouTube?
I thought that when I stepped over the line. Like, I thought, you know, there's all this money being spent. There's all these guys. There's Google. There's Microsoft. There's, you know, there's Netflix, and there's Hulu, and there's Crackle, and you know, there must be something that's, you know, that's going to give here. And but really, most of it is driven by traditional media. Mm-hmm. You know, Google, they don't, you know, I don't mean to do them a disservice, but they've never really known what they're doing in this space. And they didn't know it in 2007. They didn't know in 2009. They committed $150 million 3 years ago. We've seen nothing. They've, you know, changed the YouTube management, God knows how many times. And, you know, they shift this, and it's literally like, you know, playing musical chairs effectively with their executives. You had Microsoft that opens Microsoft Studios and then says, you know what, we're going to close Microsoft Studios. Crackle, who start by saying, we're going to invest heavily in alternative digital content, and we're going to, and now they're saying, well, we want 20-minute TV shows that basically do what they do on your network, but on a digital distribution sort of system, platform, and will kind of give you like 20% of what you would get if you know, on your budgets. So it's kind of like when in 1984, I think it was, when Colin Whelan, was it Colin Whelan, who, for Chariots of Fire, said the British are coming at the Oscars, and they never came. Yeah. It's kind of the same thing, you know, with the digital guys, like today. And that's been a frustrating point. I mean, that's been the frustrating part because, you know, the question was, are the tech guys going to catch up quick enough with the creatives, with the media companies to be able to mount a challenge, or are the media companies going to be able to catch up with the, you know, with the technical expertise? Yeah. So far, you've got, I think media is winning. I think we can sort of safely say that media is winning. And on the technology guys, you know, I don't want to be sort of, you know, have come in sort of the dark horse, and it's been really exciting to see them. But, you know, in terms of beyond those two, does anybody else cross your path? Are they going to cross your path? No.
So what role does short form have in? I mean, clearly YouTube as a platform has vast
Absolutely.
audience,
yeah,
and huge amounts of engagement, but it is clearly not in the conversations that you're having, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you have sort of traditional media being distributed digitally, and then you have original digital content, short form, you know, as an entirely new form of, you know, interactive entertainment. And the real problem with short form has always been how do you monetize it?
Right.
Yeah, and YouTube has managed to at least unlock that part of it, especially with ads. And, you know, a few years ago it was unheard of that if you have, that you would sit through a 30-second or 15-second ad to watch a 30-second clip of a cat. But you do. I mean, now you do, and you just tolerate it and just go, and they give you this nice thing where you can skip it every 5 seconds if you don't like it. But, you know, they've started to change people's habits. So there is a way to monetize. The problem comes with what we always used to call, you know, the sit back versus the lean forward environment, right? And in most cases with, you know, the top end, not even the top end, just the general, what we call traditional television or traditional films, it's all sit back. And right. Clips are still very much lean forward. Mobile devices has really helped. But again, it's kind of the 3-foot experience, or the, you know, was it the 1-foot experience or the 3-foot experience versus the 10-foot. And what you're really seeing is, from the professionally produced side, it's still very much marketing. So you sit and you watch the show, and then you've got your iPad and your phone, and you're, you know, being sort of interacting with the show on Twitter, like in that way. But then from the original media component, you're still, I mean, you look at Yahoo Screen just launched. What did they pick up? What's the first thing they picked up? They renewed Community from NBC.
Right.
That's where they're just kind of positioning themselves as alternative networks. But, you know, clips, they still have their place, but it's still being, you know, questionable monetization, because, you know, the other question is, if you're a brand, where do you want your ad? Before the cats or before House of Cards, if it was running on a, you know, right. Or before the end of that nature.
You got, you know, I mean, obviously you've seen Disney buying Maker, Fullscreen have just had a further investment. You're even looking at, you know, a company like Endemol that's putting, you know, pretty sizable bets on specifically the kind of short form content space.
Well, what you do have from short form content, especially what you would go then divide that even more. Like you've got the amateur short form content, you know, the guys with their GoPros, and then you've got professional stuff that comes out of the studios.
Well, you've got amateur, but they're still, you know, racking up a million subscribers or whatever. Right?
Absolutely. You know, you do have that kind of subdivision, but what those studios that you're talking about that get acquired, they're really incubators, and they're incubators for tomorrow's talent in features and in television. It's still, you know, I don't think there's...
It's a bit like radio. It's a bit like radio.
It's a bit like radio.
You're finding the talent on radio, you put them on TV or in theatrical.
It's kind, yeah. That's an interesting. And you can also, it's a great way for young creatives to actually learn their trade.
Right. And so do you think, I mean, do you think with that sort of traditional, like, you know, I think of Disney and Maker specifically, like a very old media organization kind of owning and taking over that younger audience. Now they've somebody said it's just a distribution platform, but if I was ever at Maker, I'd be a little bit unhappy about that because I'm making original content 24/7.
Yeah, but what you have is there are a couple of categories that those sort of studios fall into. If you go back in time, there was a company called Heavy.com, and I'm not sure if they're still around. I think they are, but they always had 10 million unique users. They had 10 million in 2005. They had 10 million in 2007, 10 million in 2010, and they made the same amount of money every year. It was, you know, and it was constant, and it was a very hardcore. Now, whether that was the same people as they got older, or they had a drop off, and then there was the same people. You have these like little sort of tiny industries, you know, dotted around the internet. So tiny with 10 million users, but it's really kind of a generational thing as well, because you do see, and there's a lot of research to back this up, where habits do change. So those young people, there's no point in having you know, they don't really latch onto the short form content because they grow up, they go to college, they get a job, they have a family, then they have kids, and then like me, they have no time to do anything. And ultimately, their viewing ends up on the couch a couple of hours a night watching TV shows, or on the iPad or whatever, and catching up where they can. Habits change, and habits change with age and life and experience. But one thing that they do that is constant is the relation with maybe specific brands, with specific IP, and specific creators, specific filmmakers. So they graduate,
right?
And the users graduate, and you know, and change.
So is there? I mean, we've seen a number of big sort of short form comedies. You see, like Tom Hanks with Electric City, I think it was. Some, you know, some like major plays in the short form space. Do you think it's something that will remain creatively interesting as opposed to commercially interesting, or?
I think it will remain creative. I mean, you know, short films and 16mm short films 30 years ago were, you know, creatively interesting.
Right.
You know, but they were also training wheels and the training ground. And I think, you know, making making however complex, you know, a series of short films and, you know, and clips and so on is a fundamentally different endeavor to, okay, now you've got a staff of 10, you're going to deliver 20 episodes, and we're investing $4 million an episode.
Right.
You know, but it has its allure, and you got to remember, it's you know, that none of these guys also exist in isolation. So from a creative standpoint, you know, you have agents and managers and, you know, a whole industry that kind of is trying to push you up the, you know, the ladder.
The fee ladder.
Totally.
Any more questions? I think
great.
We're done. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.